Mm. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to another show of the Salmon Orca Project. I would just like to welcome everyone to the Tribal Voices Matter speaker series. And today's topic is how science can inform recovery of wild Snake River salmon and steelhead. I am your host, Angela Jackson of the Salmon Orca Project. And before we proceed, let us take a moment to honor and acknowledge the ancestral lands on which we all stand. We recognize and pay respect to the indigenous peoples and tribal nations who have been stewards of these lands for generations. The Salmon Orca Project firmly believes in power of collaboration and unity. Through this webinar series, we aim to foster a platform where tribal leaders, community members, experts, and stakeholders from various backgrounds can come together, share experiences, and work towards innovative and equitable solutions. And today, I would like to welcome our guest speaker, Russ Thurow. Thank you so much for joining us, Russ. Russ Thurow is an Emeritus Fisheries Scientist with U.S. Forest Service Rocky Mountain Research Station. He has fisheries degrees from the University of Wisconsin, Stevens Point, and the University of Idaho. For more than 40 years, he has been investigating wild Snake River Basin salmon and steelhead. He received the Idaho Chapter AFS Lifetime Achievement Award and the 2020 Leopold Conservation Award from Fly Fishers International. Russ is intimately familiar with Central Idaho's Middle Fork Salmon River Basin and its remarkable aquatic resources. Thank you so much for joining us, Russ, and I would like to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Angela, and thanks to the Nez Perce tribe for inviting me to participate in this webinar series. I'm going to turn off my video and share my screen, and we'll get started. So I am going to talk about the science of recovery in the Snake River Basin. But before I begin, I'm going to give some background information for folks that may not be as familiar with salmon and steelhead as some of us are. They have an extraordinary life cycle. They spawn and rear in fresh water. They migrate to saltwater, the brackish water, the estuary, where they go through this remarkable transformation that allows them to move from fresh water into saltwater. And then they rear in the ocean where they pretty much feed constantly until they mature and return. They're what we call anadromous fish, which means they spawn in fresh, mature in salt. And I'm going to primarily focus today on spring summer Chinook salmon, but what I'm talking about will really relate also to our steelhead and our Pacific lamprey. So what does salmon need? Basically, they need three things. They need spawning and rearing habitat, also known as natal habitat. They need a migration corridor to and from the ocean, which is where we measure a metric called SAR. And then they need an estuary and an ocean. And basically, our Snake River stocks have two of the three necessary factors. What they lack is a migration corridor that's been dramatically altered. Two life stages I'd like you to keep in mind over the course of the presentation. One is the egg to pre-smolt stage, from when the eggs are buried and the fry hatch and emerge, to when they rear in varying periods in fresh water as par, and then finally they out-migrate as pre-smolts. And that occurs entirely in that freshwater natal habitat. The second life stage is a smolt to adult stage, which is where that acronym SAR comes from, when the smolts leave, rear in the ocean, and then return as adults to spawn. And that's where those SARs are measured. So the Columbia River Basin that we're part of here in the Snake Basin historically was the most productive Chinook salmon habitat in the world. estimated 10 to 16 million salmon and steelhead annually returned into the basin. And they migrated long, long distances. I live in Salmon, Idaho, along the Salmon River at the base of the Salmon River Mountains. These iconic fish have been used to name a number of places across Idaho and the Northwest. There are businesses that are named after salmon. And it's been written that the Pacific Northwest is anywhere a salmon can swim, and that's a very large area indeed. This is the Snake River Basin. I'm going to focus on this today. And the Snake Basin was disproportionately important because although it constituted less than 20% of the flow in the Columbia, it provided more than half the steelhead, almost half the summer Chinook, and about 40% of the spring Chinook. And this is the bounty that used to be. All these fish caught in one day by 2 men. This is pretty excessive by our standards today, but the point is, this is the abundance that was here. And these abundances brought immense values. First of all, they've been valuable for indigenous people for at least 16,500 years. That date keeps getting pushed back farther with new archaeological finds, for essential food and for cultural and ceremonial reasons. And that continues today. These Nez Perce youth have a salmon here, and Nez Perce elders will tell you that salmon DNA is literally in their DNA. In addition, these fish provided recreational fisheries. This was a common catch in Idaho into the 1960s. In the 1950s and 60s, you could fish for spring Chinook for 6 weeks. You could fish for summer Chinook for 5 weeks. After that, almost a 3-month season. You could fish the entire Snake, Salmon, Clearwater rivers, and all their tributaries. And those fisheries were really the economic engines of small communities like mine for outfitting, for tackle, food, clothing, lodging, fuel, etc. Salmon are also a keystone species, which means they are basically the foundation for the entire ecosystem. More than 130 species depend on salmon during some portion of their life cycle. And finally, salmon have intrinsic values. Rachel Carson wrote, "Wonder is a transformational emotion." And I've experienced that myself, and I also experienced it through my daughter. When she was 4, we hiked into a Middle Fork tributary and crawled through the willows and watched a pair of salmon spawning. I held onto the back of her jacket so she could lean out over the stream. And she looked back at me with this sort of wild look in her eyes, and she said, "Dad, it's like magic." There is truly magic in these fish. So, the science of salmon recovery is very clear and compelling. And I'm going to cover 5 topics today. The first one, more depth in SARs. Secondly, the status of the fish. Third, an Idaho case study. Fourth, the path forward. And fifth, why we're so confident that recovery is feasible. So SARs are basically the relation or the ratio of number of adults returning from the number of smolts that outmigrated. So that smolt to adult return rate. And it's an accurately measured first order objective as indicated by the ISAB. It explains about 80% of salmon survival variability. And the Power Council, as a result, has adopted recovery goals that are very clear. An average of 4% to achieve recovery with a range of 2 to 6. So we must have at least a 2% SAR, in other words, 2 adults returning for every 100 smolts that outmigrate to sustain Snake River populations. The 4% is needed to achieve the healthy and harvestable goal. So here's the path of Idaho salmon coming out of central Idaho, down the Salmon, down the Snake, down the Columbia, and they do this arc off the Aleutians. That may be a 4,000-mile journey, and they may do this multiple times, just remarkable. This green circle shows the area where the major changes have occurred in the migration corridor. And there's decades of evidence that clearly indicates through SARs that dams are the primary cause of our salmon declines in the Snake Basin. In the 1960s, with 4 dams in place, SARs ranged from 3.5 to 6.5. As 4 additional dams were added, those SARs frequently drop below 1%. And that's when we experience severe population declines. Here's some quotes. Fantastic fishing through the 1950s and 60s, and not by coincidence, began to steeply decline about the time the last shovel of dirt went into Lower Granite Dam in the early 1970s. Here's another quote from 1974 by an Idaho fish and game biologist. Idaho steelhead anglers were dealt a severe blow with the unprecedented emergency closure of the state's waters to fishing. The foremost killer of our salmon and steelhead is recognized as the Snake and Columbia River dams. So we've known this since the 70s. Here's more evidence that dams are the primary cause. Columbia Basin Fish and Wildlife Authority in 1990, dams and reservoirs are the single greatest threat to persistence of salmon and steelhead in the Snake. NOAA Fisheries 2022 report, hydrosystem impacts, including direct and indirect mortality, are the largest threats in the Snake River Basin. We have some SAR comparisons across drainages through what's called the Comparative Survival Study, the CSS. And these salmon experience the same ocean conditions, same predation rates, same treaty and non-treaty harvest. And here's the data. On the vertical axes, you see SARs. On the horizontal axis, number of dams to pass. So in the John Day with 3 dams, SARs are 3.5 for Chinook. In the Yakima above 4 dams, 2.1. In the Snake above 8, 1.1. And compare that to the lower range of the Power Council goal of 2%. We're about half there in the Snake Basin. Steelhead, SARs, Deschutes above 2 dams, 5.8. John Day above 3, 5. Yakima above 4, 4.3. Snake above 8, 2%. Again, there's that low end range, 2%. So the difference here across these 4 systems is the number of dams they pass, and that overwhelms these other factors. Here's another example. This is SARs for steelhead over time. 1960s, 7.3. That dropped to 3.5 in the late 70s and 80s, then down to 2.3. Now we're at 2. And again, what changed? 4 more dams added between 1969 and 1975. The ocean is a major driver of salmon abundance, but under current conditions, the hydro system is overwhelming those effects. So in order to improve survival, it's necessary to restore that migration corridor that will result in more smolts surviving to the ocean, and then healthier smolts because that indirect mortality will be alleviated. So we'll have more survival of adults for the smolts that are going out. So what's the status of our fish? Well, unfortunately, like a lot of topics these days, it depends who you ask. Here's a couple of quotes. It's time to recognize salmon runs are improving at record rates, and salmon returns are higher than they've been in years. Well, these are uninformed guesses at best, because these folks are susceptible to what we call the shifting baseline syndrome. This was first postulated by Pauly in 1995, and it basically means that with each generation, our expectation of ecological condition shifts downward and our standards are lowered. So from the huge abundances in the 1880s down to current levels. And the dangers of the shifting baseline syndrome are, we're completely unaware of historical abundances. We overlook the true production potential of these systems. The result is unrealistically low recovery goals, and even modest improvements that are inaccurately seen as much more than they are, the so-called record runs. And finally, it's really a fundamental lack of faith in nature to recover when the correct actions are taken. So here's what the data-driven assessments tell us about fish status. Snake River salmon and steelhead are at increasing risk of extinction, even though a vast area of high-quality habitat remains. Today, only 1% to 2% of historic abundances, all populations face extinction. And then this latest NOAA report, priority is highest for Snake River spring, summer, Chinook, and steelhead as stocks that are at high risk of extinction. Well, fortunately, facts are stubborn things, as John Adams wrote in 1770. And as Aldous Huxley followed up with, facts do not cease to exist because they are ignored. So these are the facts. Wild Snake River Chinook salmon were ESA listed as threatened in 1992. Here's the trend in fish from 1957 through 2023. And wild Chinook salmon harvest in Idaho has been closed for 45 years, since 1978. In 1992, when these stocks were listed, there were a little over 12,600, 600 Chinook that returned to Lower Granite Dam. In 2023, a little over 7,000 fish returned. And I'll come back and talk about this spike in a few minutes. So despite unprecedented recovery efforts, 30 years and billions of dollars spent, we've experienced a 43% decline since these fish are ESA listed. That's pretty much the definition of failure when it comes to recovery. What about steelhead? Steelhead were ESA listed as threatened in 1997. Wild steelhead harvest in Idaho has been closed for 39 years. And here's the trend in steelhead overlaid with the trend in Chinook. Those 4 stars represent those additional 4 dams that were built from 1969 and 1975. And you can see the severe steep declines in the late 60s and 70s are coincident with the construction of those dams. So those 4 additional dams to make 8 cause lower SARs, resulting in these declines. Nez Perce tribe has put together a quasi-extinction analysis for spring summer Chinook across the Snake Basin. And this is pretty alarming because it shows that almost 40% of these populations have fewer than 50 spawners today. And the predictions are that by 2028, almost 60% of these populations could be at 50 spawners or less. Jay Hesse put together this stock status grading system, and we have no fish that are at historic, abundant, or healthy levels today. We have one population, fall Chinook salmon, that are at viable, and those stocks are heavily affected by hatchery supplementation. We have another stock, coho salmon, that have gone extinct, but are being refounded by hatchery programs. And I'll talk a little bit more about these other 2, the high risk and quasi-extinct. So extinction is literally looming for spring summer Chinook salmon, for steelhead, and for Pacific lamprey. And sockeye are functionally extinct because it's basically supported by a conservation hatchery that's maintaining that population. So the Grim Reaper is literally walking off with our fish. So what's the consequence? What are the consequences of this? Well, we see declining ecological function. These are data from Redfish Lake, over 1,300 years of nutrients in lake sediments. And you can see those nutrient levels fluctuate somewhat over time, but on the far right, you see that highlighted area. That's when dams were installed on the Columbian snake. And as one of the Shoshone-Bannock biologists said to me, we're headed for bankruptcy in terms of the nutrient levels. We also see severe declines in opportunity and the economics that recreational fisheries bring to communities. The green lines on the right show the former wild steelhead streams where you could fish. That thin red line shows the current areas where you can fish for steelhead. And so there's been a huge decline in quantity of fish being caught and also the quality. Compare those big beast salmon river steelhead on the left to the hatchery fish the guy's holding on the right. No wonder the guy on the right is not smiling. We also have a failure to meet tribal treaty obligations, not only for the Nez Perce and the Shoshone-Bannock tribes, but a whole variety of tribes in the Columbia Basin. And there's also declining cultural values and ceremonial values because these fish are such an essential part of the cultures of these tribal communities. So bottom line on fish status, wild Snake River salmon and steelhead cannot recover under the status quo. Salmon and 8 dams are not compatible, and effective new actions are going to be necessary to meet those Power Council goals for SARs. So here's the Columbia Basin. Here's those 8 dams again, the 4 snake dams shown in red. Well, we're fortunate because we have an experimental control. We have wild salmon populations in wilderness habitat right here in the Middle Fork Salmon River Basin. And I've been fortunate to work in this system since the late 1970s. We have some remarkable databases to track these populations. First one I'll call the IDFG index red counts. These were initiated in 1957. We have a 66-year continuous database, and it was initiated and maintained by these iconic biologists that many of you have crossed paths with. And trust me, it takes a lot of effort to maintain a long-term data set. So today, these populations are still being tracked, and it's more of a collaborative approach now with IDFG, Nez Perce Tribe, Shoshone-Bannock Tribe, and U.S. Forest Service biologists collecting these data. We also have a database I'll call the RMRS Continuous Red Counts. This was initiated in 1995. It's been continued through 2023. In recent years, it's been maintained by Idaho Fish and Game. And it's a spatially continuous count, which means we survey all the areas outside those index areas to get a total estimate of fish across the Middle Fork. We georeference red locations, which gives us extensive analytical power. There you can see a red on the left and the shadow of the helicopter, which is primarily how we conduct these surveys. And here's an example of that data. You can see the georeference red locations. So we have these type of data now for 29 years. So the causes of salmon declines have been termed the 4 H's by the federal agencies. And these include degraded natal habitat, detrimental effects of hatchery supplementation, excessive harvest, and hydrosystem development or dams. Well, the Middle Fork is exceptional because it has wilderness habitat, primarily wilderness habitat. And a lot of the habitat alterations that occurred in the past through mining or through grazing have pretty much been resolved. The grazing allotments have been closed. The Shoshone-Bannock Tribe did a lot of work on the mining activities in the upper basin to restore those channels. In 1940, Chapman wrote, "The Middle Fork possesses immense spawning areas for spring Chinook, which to my knowledge are not surpassed or reached in quantity or quality any place else in the Columbia River drainage." So he was saying, arguably the Middle Fork had the finest natal habitat in the Columbia Basin. Well, that habitat has actually improved since the 1940s with those actions I just mentioned. It has only wild native salmon. There are no hatcheries in the Middle Fork. And these fish are very rare. Only 4% of the historic spring-summer Chinook range in the Columbia still supports wild fish like these. They have tremendous life history diversity, spending less than a year to 2 years in freshwater and less than a year to 5 years in saltwater. Plus, we have precocial males that mature without going to the ocean. So when you add all that up, we have the potential for 18 age classes contributing from prior brood years. And that diversity spreads the risk, buffers fluctuations, and enables them to adapt to this dynamic environment in the Snake Basin. No others in the world spawn so high and migrate so far. These fish are migrating more than 1,100 kilometers, and in some cases spawning above 2,100 meters in elevation, over 6,000 feet in elevation. And that buffers them against climate change. They've been called the ultra marathoners, the Olympic champs, the best of the best, and all of these accolades apply to these fish. They're still genetically diverse despite these low population levels we've been experiencing. They have both within and across population differentiation, which means the fish in lower Camas Creek are different than the fish in upper Camas Creek, and Camas Creek fish differ from loon, differ from big, etc. These fish also are subjected to low harvest rates in the ocean based on tagging, very, very low harvest rates. And the treaty and non-treaty fishery has been averaging about 9% since 1980. And those harvest rates are not responsible for the ESA listing. So the Middle Fork has exceptional habitat. unique native fish, low harvest. So only one H applies here, and that's the hydro H. So this is the trend in wild Mid-Fork Chinook based on the index red count since 1957. We can ask the question, how does this compare to the overall Snake River populations? And that's the overall Snake River population. Again, that spike I'll come and talk about. And you can see that these are pretty much identical trends, which is interesting because the Middle Fork has optimal habitat, no hatcheries, low harvest, so only that hydro H applies. So this strongly suggests that the hydro H is responsible for the trajectory in both of these populations. If we compare Middle Fork historic versus contemporary conditions, historically, about 50,000 salmon entered the Middle Fork annually into the 1960s. Again, you could harvest 2 fish a day, you could fish for 3 months. Since the 1990s, we've averaged 1,500 salmon, 3%. There's been no fishing since 1978. In 2023, 1% of the 1960s returned to the Middle Fork. So what does 1% of abundance look like? Well, it looks like mile after mile after mile of exceptional spawning habitat with no fish. It looks like smaller and fewer West Slope cutthroat. It looks like no fishing. All Middle Fork populations are non-viable and at high risk of extinction. How do we know outside basin factors are responsible for that? When more adult salmon return, as they did in the early 2000s, these are the trajectories that we would expect in subsequent years. Instead, we had a 10-fold decline from 03 to 06. So that tells us that increased mortality outside that natal habitat is negating the benefits of more adults that returned and more juveniles that were produced. So these poor migration conditions are causing low SARs again that drive these trajectories in these populations. So this experimental control, wild salmon in wilderness, and the fact that these fish are at high risk of extinction confirms that the hydro system is the primary cause of declines in the overall Snake River Basin. There is a path forward. The plan for analyzing and testing hypotheses, acronym PATH, was a collaborative process to evaluate Columbia Basin and anadromous fish recovery. More than 30 participants from 15 state and federal agencies, tribes, universities, consultants gathered, and their conclusion in 1998 was the natural Snake River option, or the breach option, is the only option that will provide recovery. This has the highest certainty of success and the lowest risk of failure. That was 1998. Those conclusions have been reaffirmed by scientific review panels, state, federal, and tribal scientists for the past 26 years. Fisheries science informing lower Snake River Dam breaching is abundant. The NOAA Rebuilding Report in 2022 being one of the more recent ones, a Storch et al. Paper, but there are 223 unique citations that address this issue. Here's a quote from the NOAA report. For Snake River stocks, the centerpiece action is restoring the lower Snake River via dam breaching. And here's a recent paper published in 2024. This relied on a number of long-term data sets. This shows the Middle Fork and the fact that only 4 of 23 populations show positive growth at our current low SARs, around 1%. With migration corridor restoration, we predict positive growth in all 23 of these populations, even at the lower end of the Power Council goal, the 2% range. And here's a quote from that paper. The primary remaining and most effective action to increase Middle Fork salmon is to restore migration corridors by breaching the 4 lower snake dams. So all of this science has been rolled into a great document, the Columbia Basin Restoration Initiative, and I would urge you to read this. It was a collaborative process, and it basically has a vision and a roadmap of how to achieve recovery of Snake River stocks. It honors tribal nations, it provides affordable and reliable clean power, and it builds upon the resilience of stakeholders, with the outcome of being those healthy and harvestable salmon and steelhead populations. And fortunately, the United States government has stepped up. In December, the Biden-Harris administration announced this agreement, and this agreement acknowledges that Lower Snake River Dam removal is necessary to restore healthy and harvestable stocks. And it also commits federal actions to restore native fish and assess replacement of services provided by the dams. So, why are we so confident that recovery is achievable? Well, we have a lot of quality habitat, abundant habitat in the Snake Basin. We still have unique, locally adapted fish. We have fish that are still genetically diverse, and we have high elevation refugia. Climate change is here. It's increasing threats to salmon in freshwater habitats and in the ocean, the so-called blob shown there in the lower left. But the Snake River Basin has a lot of high quality, high elevation refugia. 40% of its public lands lie within wilderness, and 40% of the current cold water habitat in the Columbia Basin exists in the Snake Basin. And by 2080, it's predicted 45% of the cold water habitat will lie in the Snake Basin. These fish also still have demonstrated resiliency. I've been teasing you with that spike in the Snake River in the upper graph there. Well, that occurred right here. 2001 through 2003, we had a 5-fold increase in number of adults returning to the Middle Fork Basin. And look at the low numbers that came from in the late 1990s. This would result in 2 factors. We had more runoff and faster travel time for the smolts as they migrated to the ocean. So more survived through the hydro system. And then we had an upturn in ocean productivity, cold water upwelling, more food, more high lipid copepods, for example. So we had more survive in the ocean. And these fish came back in much larger numbers. Now, the bad news is it didn't persist. We had that 10-fold drop from 03 to 06. But the fact here that these fish did respond tells us that if actions are taken to restore the migration corridor, these fish will definitely respond. So the dynamic landscape in the Snake Basin has shaped the diversity and resiliency of its wild salmon and steelhead. Fires, floods, avalanches, debris flows. Some key concepts to keep in mind. First of all, complex life histories result from disturbance. Life history diversity is the solution of survival in dynamic environments. And diversity reduces risk, the so-called portfolio effect. So these essential natural ecological processes, fires, floods, avalanches, alter the landscape to create and maintain a diverse habitat template, which allows for the expression of salmon life history and genetic diversity, and those in concert produce population resiliency. So how will salmon survive the future? Here's a quote by Sturrock. In environments facing increasingly volatile futures, it is prudent to promote and maintain diverse life history portfolios. We have these in the snake. And further, restoring numbers is a priority because it increases buffering. So while locally adapted, salmon and steelhead are best suited to adapt to an uncertain future, the more there are, the more buffering, the more likely they'll persist for our grandchildren. So why are we so confident? All the building blocks are present. And we have demonstrated wild fish resiliency. We have decades of science that supports this. And we have many successful examples of other restoration efforts through dam breaching. Elwha, white salmon, Kennebec, Penobscot, et cetera, and the Klamath is in progress. In 2020, 271 dams were removed in 23 states, and that reconnected more than 4,300 miles of rivers. The snake could be the next big project. E.O. Wilson wrote, "We are drowning in information while starving for wisdom." Well, the wisdom from scientific consensus tells us to recover Snake River stocks, restore the corridor. And if we do that, these resilient wild fish will recover. And when salmon thrive, the whole ecosystem around them thrives, including people. And what once was, will be, steelhead as big as your children. Again, this is one of the things you did on your honeymoon in the 1940s in Stanley Basin. So the bottom line is barging, irrigation, any energy production, those infrastructures have alternatives. They can be replaced. We built them, we can replace them. Wild salmon and steelhead in the Snake Basin, those are irreplaceable. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you. So I'll stop sharing.
Thank you so much for that presentation. And I often find myself, as I'm listening to great speakers speak on this subject, it elicits from me an emotional reaction. And true to form, some of that discussion had me in a very emotional state as I was listening to you. I did have a question before we go ahead and open the floor. So go ahead, audience, as you're formulating your questions, post them in the Q&A, and I will go ahead and in a moment read those questions or get through as many as we can, as we have plenty of time toward the end of our show here. But I was thinking about your chart where you had talked about that spike from 2001 to 2003. And you were discussing the how the smolt's survival rate was improved because of faster flows regarding the spring, I'm assuming spring runoff. How long what is the time frame that is preferred for them to get from high country to the ocean?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the last part, Angela?
What is the time frame that is preferred for the fish to get from the high country headwaters to the ocean?
Well, so historically, a drop of water from where Lower Granite now sits to where Bonneville sits took 2 days during the runoff period when the smolts were migrating. Since construction of the hydro system, it's been averaging close to 20 days. And in drought years, it's been as much as 40 days. So, you know, historically, the fish evolved with a fairly rapid migration from the headwater areas down to the ocean. That's definitely been delayed. So there's a number of papers, some great work done by Petrosky and Schaller and others that shows that there's a real direct relationship between travel time and survival. So that's one of the real benefits of breaching the 4 lower Snake River dams. It would really increase the speed of travel for those smolts to get to the ocean.
Thank you so much for answering my question. We have our first question from our audience is, what sequence of dam removal would make ecological sense? Could you postulate as to what might be the outcome with 3 of the 4 dams being removed, as Lower Snake or Lower Granite may be the most difficult one politically to remove?
Yeah, so I guess I'll preface this. I'm not an engineer, and I don't work in the migration corridor specifically. So there are people at the Fish Passage Center, et cetera, that would probably be more qualified to answer, you know, which of the 4 snake dams might be the first priority, second. So I'm really not as qualified to answer that question. You know, the data is very clear, though, that removing them or breaching them is going to, as we just talked about, improve the migration to the ocean. It's going to do a number of other things too. It's going to alleviate some of the temperature issues that we've been facing because those reservoirs really act as heat sinks. In addition, there's a lot of mortality in the reservoirs themselves from predation by introduced walleye, et cetera. And then obviously there's mortality of smolts as they're passing over or through the dams or the bypass system. So, there's a combination of different things that are going to benefit fish by breaching and restoring that migration corridor. But, the nuts and bolts about which dams should be the priority, what the sequence of removal needs to be, I'm not really qualified to answer that question.
Thank you so much for giving it a whirl. Okay, so our next question. Hello, thank you for your wonderful, informative presentation. Can you speak about the timing and how much time do the salmon have before we must take action?
Well, I mean, we must take action, and actions have been in progress, for over 30 years now. 5 years ago, I was interviewed by a New York Times reporter, and he asked me, how long do we have before these fish go extinct? And based on the information I had at the time, I said, the consensus seems to be we have about 4 generations. And these fish on average are five years per generation. So that would be 20 years. So that was 5 years ago. So I would say we have 15 years or less. And again, the life history diversity, the resiliency, that's why we still have these fish. If they didn't have the kind of diversity and resiliency they do, they would have been extinct years ago. But we're at a point where we have to take more aggressive actions. As I showed, billions of dollars spent over 30 years, and we've seen a 40% decline since they were ESA listed in 92. That really suggests that all the actions that have been taken to date have just not been sufficient, which is why the work that was done by PATH in the 90s and others, leads to the next action that needs to be taken is to breach and restore the lower snake migration corridor.
What does riparian restoration of the Snake River Dam removal look like? And that's from Eleanor Matrice, Pendorio River in northeastern Washington.
I'm sorry, repeat that again, please.
What does riparian restoration of the snake after dam removal look like?
Oh, okay. Again, I'm a fish biologist, not a riparian expert, but I am aware that with breach, there would be about 140 miles of riparian area that would be eligible to be restored. And that's basically 280 miles because, excuse me, it's on each side of the river. And, I know there's been discussions. Historically, there were orchards. There was obviously a lot of wildlife habitat. My understanding is there were also lots of islands. I want to say 40 or 60 islands. So there would be a tremendous amount of habitat potential for wildlife restoration. There certainly are archaeological sites also that would be uncovered that are currently under those reservoirs. So, I think the potential is huge for restoration of, potentially orchards and maybe even vineyards and things like that, and the recreational base that could be supported by that riparian restoration for bird hunting and waterfowl hunting and fishing and, a whole host of other things. So a lot of benefits could be restored that have been flooded by those reservoirs.
Thank you. Is there comparable data on SARS for other large West Coast Chinook systems, such as Sacramento, Fraser, Copper, Yukon, and etc.?
I'm not familiar with those data. I guess I would be surprised if there aren't SAR data for some of those populations.
Can you speak to the value of the genetics of wild MF Chinook and the difficulty or even impossibility of replacing them if we allow them to go extinct?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And again, I focused on wild stocks and really didn't talk about hatchery fish much. But the bottom line is it's pretty much impossible to maintain the diversity of wild populations in hatchery programs. There's going to be a net loss in fitness. You know, the natural selection that these wild fish go through are the reason they have that resiliency. And there's a number of papers, some of the work done by Christie starting in 2016. It's pretty alarming how soon after fish are brought into a hatchery, we start seeing changes. One of their papers shows that after one generation, there was a change in 700 genes, and many of those were linked to migration. So I guess one of the take homes is, you know, we're facing an uncertain future with climate change, and wild fish give us the best chance to adapt to those changes. Hatchery fish are really, they're not a long-term solution. They're necessary right now to maintain tribal fisheries and recreational fisheries. Like I said, I mean, in Idaho, we haven't been able to fish for wild Chinook for 45 years. So there would have been no fishing at all without some hatchery programs. But hatcheries are not a long-term solution. Wild fish are really what we need to rebuild if we're going to maintain salmon's populations in the future.
What are the state legislature and Idaho Power doing to address this? Are they on the same page? Do you know?
Again, I'm a biologist, not a politician, but I mean, I think it is revealing that the 6 sovereigns agreement that just came out between the 4 tribes, the state of Oregon and the state of Washington, Idaho was not party to that. So, you know, Idaho is not, at least at the governor and legislature's level, not actively involved in recovery. I don't know the reasons for that, but you know, that is a fact. Idaho does stand to benefit perhaps most of any of the Pacific Northwest states with restoration of these populations. You know, it would be a huge economic boon to the state of Idaho, and communities like mine and salmon have suffered because of the loss of those fisheries. And you know, there is a hatchery supported fishery, but as I demonstrated, it's just a small fraction of what the potential is with rebuilding these populations.
So we have plenty of more questions that you can go ahead and send your questions into me at angela.j@nespers.org, and we can see if we can get some more follow-up to the questions that you're seeking. At this time, I think we are coming to the end of our program. And I definitely would like to thank you, Russ Thurow, for coming and joining us here and providing us with a lot of information to digest. And with that being said, this program is being recorded and will be on YouTube for later access at the Salmon Orca Project. You can just search Salmon Orca Project on the YouTube. You can also access more of our content at the Salmon Orca Project website, or follow us on Facebook at Salmon Orca Project. I did want to bring up, we do have we actually have 2 shows in June upcoming. We are participating alongside the Seattle the orcamonth.com tribute to the orca event in Seattle at the Seattle Aquarium. And how we are participating is we have a show at noon. The theme for next month for the Orca Alliance is around toxicity and water. And to that effect, we are presenting a show on traditional foods and how they relate to human health. We will have Nez Perce Tribes Director, Cultural Director, Mr. Nakia Williamson, and we will have Nez Perce Tribes Nimipu Health, Dr. Kim Hartwig with us. And that show is on June 12th, also at noon. And then just a few weeks later, we will also be bringing in some participants of the Salmon Youth Protectors on June 26th at noon. They will come in and give a presentation on some activities that they have been doing, such as their recent trip to Washington, D.C. to discuss their activities, and they'll also give a presentation on what they're doing to call to action. And so we welcome them, and we would like you to make sure that you come back and stay tuned next month for both of those shows up and coming. And I am going to put right along in the chat the link for the for registration for the All Our Relations tribute to the orca. And so thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Mr. Russ Thurow, do you have any closing remarks?
Well, I just want to thank you again for the opportunity. And I guess I would say for those of you that have additional questions, feel free to send them in to Angela, and then she will get them to me. And, I may just email back to you. So if you can add an email to your question, that would be great. Thanks again for everybody that tuned in. And I guess maybe the other comment I'll make, there's been a lot of misinformation that's been put out to the public on this issue. And I think it's really important to, learn what the facts are. And the more people that I think understand this issue and how compelling it is, I think the more likely the actions that are going to recover these populations will be taken. So thanks for taking an interest in tuning in, and thanks again, Angela, and to the Nez Perce tribe for this opportunity.
Thank you so much. And that concludes our May presentation. Have a good day, folks.